Prime Minister Mark Carney spent his day in Abu Dhabi locking in a new investment pact, touring a cultural landmark, and trying to lure capital from one of the world's wealthiest countries.
What happened in the UAE wasn't supposed to happen. Mark Carney arrived for a simple trade visit, but within hours, the entire trip flipped into something far bigger.
While this country is a growing hub of economic activity, it's also under scrutiny over its involvement in the war in Sudan. And today, Carney had back-to-back meetings with big financial players, but took no questions on what specific security issues he raised with the president.
Crowds, cameras, and officials rushed toward him like he was a global heavyweight, not just a visiting prime minister. It felt like the world had quietly shifted overnight.
Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. And the two men talked about some regional security concerns, and the PMO wouldn't say exactly which security concerns they were talking about, but the big one in this region right now is the civil war in Sudan.
And Canada suddenly found itself in a new spotlight. People watching could tell something unusual was unfolding, something that hinted at deals, pressure, and a deeper story behind the warm welcome.
But really the big focus was on trade. And here's the news from today. Both Canada and the UAE agreeing they're going to start negotiations on a foreign investor protection agreement, as well as a comprehensive economic partnership. And that kind of partnership is often the precursor to a full-blown trade deal.
And the moment Carney stepped into the UAE's Grand Mosque, that feeling grew even stronger. This wasn't routine diplomacy anymore. This was the start of something much bigger. The moment Mark Carney stepped into the UAE, everything felt different. What was supposed to be a normal day on a trade trip suddenly turned into something much bigger. You could see it from the way the welcome unfolded. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't routine. It looked like the kind of reception usually reserved for world leaders with massive global influence. From the moment he arrived, Carney wasn't treated like a visitor. He was treated like someone the country had been waiting for. Cameras lined up. Reporters rushed forward. Every angle, every step, someone was recording it, and that's when people watching noticed something strange. The UAE press wasn't covering a meeting, they were covering him. But the real turning point came when Carney was invited inside the UAE's biggest and most famous mosque. This wasn't a quick tour or a polite photo op. It was a full, carefully arranged walkthrough of one of the country's most important landmarks. For a Canadian leader, this almost never happens. Not in this way, and not with this level of access. Inside the mosque, Carney looked calm, but you could feel the weight of the moment. The building itself was massive and stunning, but the real story was the reaction around him. Reporters scrambled for better positions. Photographers raised their lenses the second he moved. It felt less like a diplomatic visit and more like a spotlight moment. And that's when it hit observers around the world. Something had shifted. Canada wasn't in the background anymore. Carney wasn't just representing the country, he was becoming a figure other nations wanted to be close to. But what made this welcome even more surprising was what came right after. And that's where the story gets even bigger. Right after the huge welcome, things moved fast. The big moment came when Mark Carney sat down with UAE leaders to sign a deal that had been stuck for almost a decade. It wasn't a small agreement or a symbolic handshake. It was a full foreign investment protection deal, the kind that can reshape a country's economic path for years. For Canada, this was a breakthrough. The last time a Canadian leader had a major one-on-one meeting with the UAE was more than 40 years ago. Most people didn't even realize the relationship had been that quiet for that long, but Carney brought that silence to an end in a single day. The agreement he signed may not sound flashy, but its impact is huge. It creates a safer and more stable path for UAE money to flow into Canada. And we're not talking about small amounts. The UAE controls massive funds, including sovereign wealth funds with over $1 trillion worldwide. Now that money can help support Canadian mega projects that need long-term backing. Think about ports, mining operations, energy projects, and big infrastructure builds. These are huge, expensive plans that take years to finish. With this deal in place, Canada has a strong financial partner ready to help push them forward. What makes this even more important is the timing. With Donald Trump driving a tense trade environment, the US has become unpredictable. Carney knows Canada can't rely on one partner anymore. That's why this deal matters so much. It opens a new lane, a new source of capital, a new anchor outside US influence. And the UAE didn't stop there. They also launched full free trade talks with Canada, aiming to deepen the relationship even more. But the real power of this trip wasn't in the public events. It came from what happened behind closed doors. And that part of the story is even more revealing. Once the public events were over, the real work began. Carney stepped into a world most people never see. The private rooms where major deals are shaped. These meetings didn't have cameras. They didn't have reporters. They were closed off, quiet, and carefully controlled. And that alone showed how serious things were. Carney met with leaders from some of the UAE's biggest sovereign wealth funds. These are groups that manage hundreds of billions of dollars and place their money in projects all over the world. When they sit down with someone, it's not for small talk, it's because they see real potential. And during these talks, they explored everything from energy and minerals to new technology and long-term partnerships. Then came the private dinner with the UAE's national security advisor. This wasn't a public speech or a staged moment. It was a deep, strategic conversation about issues that affect entire regions, from the Middle East to parts of Africa. These are the kinds of meetings that can shape cooperation for years, and they usually stay off the record. That's why no Canadian media were allowed in. The discussions were simply too sensitive. Back in Canada, analysts have been saying something important. Carney needs real results. For years, people complained about overpromising and under-delivering from Ottawa, so these meetings carried pressure. Carney had to show he could bring home more than headlines. He needed commitments, partnerships, and proof that Canada is still a strong player on the world stage. And the signals coming out of the UAE suggested that Carney was doing exactly that. Big investors were interested. Key officials were engaged. Doors that had been closed for decades were opening again. But this all leads to the bigger question. Why now? Why is the UAE suddenly treating Canada like a top partner? The answer starts to appear when you look at the global picture, and that's where the story turns next. The reason the UAE is giving Canada this kind of attention becomes clearer when you zoom out. The world is changing fast, and both countries see a chance to reshape their futures. For the UAE, Canada offers something rare: stability. Canada has strong tech talent, a modern economy, and major resources. It's a safe place to invest long-term money, and in a world full of uncertainty, that kind of stability is valuable. Canada, on the other hand, needs new partners. For too long, the country relied almost entirely on the United States. It made sense because of geography, but it also created a problem. When Donald Trump returned and started pushing new tariffs and threats, things became risky. Carney knows that depending on one country is a weakness, so he's building new links that can protect Canada in the long run. That's why deals with the UAE matter so much. They bring in huge investment, they open new markets, they let Canada stand stronger even when the US becomes unpredictable. Experts say this kind of strategy should have started years ago, but the leadership wasn't there. Now Carney is trying to catch up fast. The UAE also sees benefits. Canada has expertise in defense, aerospace, and advanced technology. The two countries already started talking about AI and data centers last month, and with the new agreements, both sides can go further. They can build real partnerships instead of just talking about them. This moment feels less like a simple trade visit and more like a reset button. Canada is stepping into a wider world again, and the UAE is opening a path that could shape Canada's economy for decades. But the final takeaway from this trip doesn't come from one deal or one meeting. It comes from what this all means for Canada's future, and that leads to the final part of the story. Carney's visit to the UAE wasn't just another stop on a trade tour, it marked a turning point for Canada. In one day, he reopened a relationship that had been quiet for decades, secured major investment protection, and pushed Canada into talks that could reshape its economy. The private meetings showed how seriously global players are taking Canada again, and how much trust is being placed in its future. For the first time in a long time, Canada isn't waiting for the world to act. It's stepping forward and choosing new partners on its own terms. What comes next will decide if this moment becomes a true shift, or the start of something even bigger.